The second Adam, Christ, came to undo the sin that was introduced by the first Adam. So shouldn't we be able to see that in the world? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Connor Swim.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horton.
When Christ came into the world, he came and really transformed things when he took on flesh, right? And then was crucified and rose from the dead and then ascended to heaven. That really changed the world. It was the transformative event, even more so than Adam's fall, in terms of how much the world changes because of that. But yet, the way Americans are taught and the way our school system works is you don't see that transformation because they kind of skip the bad parts of history to give you a sense of what it was really like and how terrible it really was. And so we did a podcast on 25 ways that Christ's coming has changed the world and transformed the world. But we thought that we should do that again because there's a lot more ways that he transformed the world. And specifically tonight, we're going to talk about the increasing shame of sin that's come since Christ brought light into the world. There's less darkness. The other area is the increasing of orderliness in the world. And it really has made huge differences. So how do we see an increasing shame of sin in the world?
I think one thing, if you want to look at shame of sin, you have to do what you were kind of saying, is you have to recognize how much the world has changed and over how much time. Because I think it's really easy to get caught up in the last 60 years or the last 80 years. And there's a part of it where, like you said, we have a real loss of history, of the sense of how the world works and how much time it's taken. When we did our last episode, a lot of the pushback we got back from people was, are you really saying that the world is, how can you even say the world has gotten better? How can you even, if you look at the world, you can tell it's gotten worse. And again, they were really focusing on a very short view of the world. Whereas when you look at it over 2,000 years, I think most of us have no sense of how bad the world was 2,000 years ago in real ways. And when you even get on what we're going to talk about now, the very first item we have on the list, it almost goes back to creation. One of the very first things that God did after Adam and Eve fell was he put clothes on them. And I think the first thing we have on our list is just people wearing clothes. If you go throughout the world, people not wearing clothes was most of the world. If it was cold, they wore things, but
frequently even then they didn't wear
right.
That much.
If they wore it if they had it, but their culture did not even create or have this sense that the body should be covered in any way whatsoever.
And if you read Genesis 3:7, it says, "Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves covering." And so they were ashamed, right? And so clothing very much ties to shame, right? They recognized now they did fig leaves, and God covered them from head to toe, basically, or at least from neck to toe. And so there was a really substantial difference in what God says shame should look like and what man said shame should look like. And so in our culture, we can look and we can go, but look at all the nudity in our culture. And a lot of the nudity in our culture is going back to be like Adam and Eve. But if you look at the history of the world, we're just becoming in a narrow area like the United States, which is very narrow when you think about it. What do we have? 330 million people. So we're a 20th of the world or whatever. In a very narrow area, it's getting to be a lot more increase in nudity. So we look and we go, oh, nudity is increasing everywhere. No, it's not. So while our culture is accepting of more and more nudity and less shame, we shouldn't think that's a historical norm. That's actually going against the trends of history.
Well, a lot of places, they had some clothes, but it was very, very minimal.
You hear the stories of missionaries going to these islands and people are naked. They teach them the gospel, and one of the first things they do, when they hear the gospel and actually repent, they put clothing on. They make clothing out of whatever they can. That's an initial response that the gospel has been effective here. And even in Nigeria, I was talking to one of the pastors there, and they go to a place occasionally up in the mountains. I forgot, somewhere in an hour or so from Jos, and there are people there that are still naked. They're essentially an unreached people. They go there occasionally, talk to them. They're not really that receptive to them, so it still happens, but it's places that have not been reached by the gospel. And when the gospel hits somewhere, there's a clear evidence of it as you see the shame they put their clothing on.
And sometimes, they'd be much more likely to leave their children naked than we are just because of cost and expense. But for adults,
right,
in society, they're always clothed. And that wasn't true where we go in Nigeria. That wasn't true 140 years ago. It simply was not at all true. They were all naked, basically, except for maybe a fig leaf.
I mean, I think like what you said earlier, too, and I really kind of want to keep emphasizing this, is even when we think of the nudity, like you said, America is a small percentage of the population. And then the nudity that exists in America is of a very small percentage of even Americans' population. And it's only in and there's very few people who actually practice it to the point of where they almost never wear clothing. I mean, that would be very rare. It's such, and so there's this part of it where, if you look at, like you talk about when the Pilgrims came, by the time the Pilgrims came, Christianity had even gotten to the point where they had segmented into, these are clothing that is for, it's clothing that were men's clothing. There was clothing that was women's clothing. The men's clothing was defined by what they did. I mean, the level of order that had come within clothing had been advancing and increasing even within Christianity, so that it was tying back to how God created man, that God created man male and female. And so a huge amount of the rebellion with clothing and nudity that's happened in the past 70 years that we've seen have specifically been against the created order and against that. So,
against the idea that God could tell us that we have to be clothed.
Right. And so, so there's this part of it where I don't even have a problem if people want to talk about current time frames, but they have to go, how did it get to the point that it was so far down that then they could rebel against it as much as they have and in such a short time period? You know what I mean? It had to have gotten better somehow before it could get worse.
And this is a good one to start with, because this one, there's no way to argue that it hasn't drastically changed in almost every society.
Right.
I mean, maybe there's a few places that went the other way, where now they're wearing less clothes. But like 99% of the world, that's not true for.
Right. Yeah. Any level of civilization that's come, it's been because of the advance of the gospel.
And even in the places where there's like real rebellion, say like gentlemen clubs, right, which is, as in terms of nudity, as rebellious as you can get, you can tell that you're driving by a gentleman's club, quote unquote, because they have no windows, everything's closed up, it looks dark. It's not like, even in their rebellion against it, they still testify to the shame of it.
Right. It's only when you get to like homosexual parades and sodomy parades where you get to be incredibly blatant about being sexual out in the open and nudity in public.
Which, of course, and those are not even close to any Aboriginal society.
Right.
Other than like Arctic. That's a little trickier. So the second thing we have that's improved over the last 2,000 years is that physical idolatry is pretty much gone. It used to be that nearly all religions were centered on worship of idols, and now there are some. There's Hinduism that has a lot of idol worship. Catholicism says they don't. So that's a step in the right direction. Claiming not to worship idols, actually not worshiping idols, is even better. But other than that, you have, Christianity obviously doesn't worship idols. Islam takes physical idolatry quite seriously. So, the actual bowing down to a statue is on a vast decline.
And because, you talked about Roman Catholicism, they pretend like they don't worship idols. The reality is that they have to say that idol, that they're not really bowing down to that idol doesn't have any power. It's just that it's to remind them of Mary or whoever else that they then say has power. So even in their explanation, they testify to their shame of bowing down before idols.
Right. In a sense, what you're saying in one way as well is that basically paganism, that aspect of paganism has pretty much gone away in a sense. If you look among people who would deny God, they wouldn't even remotely think of doing that. And like you said, where it exists within religion, they're even denying that they're doing it and trying to even distance themselves from it, even as they participate in it.
And people even in Roman Catholicism don't remember what it was like at the time of the Reformation, right? The reason that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the church in was because that there was all this worship of all these fragments of the cross and all this other garbage, and it was all this relic worship where they were worshiping not ones that they made themselves, quote unquote, but, oh, we found this finger in the ground. That must be St. Andrew's finger, so we're going to bow down and worship it. So they had rejected the idea that you could make idols, but they still made idols out of things that they found and they thought were real. But look at where Roman Catholicism is now, and it hasn't completely eliminated that. I was in a city in Belgium, and they still had a drop of blood that they paraded through the streets, and they had this big parade to worship this drop of blood. But it's incredibly reduced compared to what it was even 500 years ago at the time of the Reformation. I mean, that it was, as Martin Luther said, if you collected all the fragments of the true cross that were worshipped, it would fill like 3 ships.
Right.
And so there's just this that has just decreased even in Roman Catholicism.
And the finger bones, that was the point. That was like early AI. They had all they had 7. They had all these saints with 7 fingers or 14 fingers.
Even AI is smarter than Catholicism, though. It holds back from having,
right. It doesn't have nearly
years.
as many fingers as the saints had.
But you look at, like a lot of the early missionaries who went to these areas, and what they said is that it's not just about this sin that you are bowing down to this inanimate object. They would say it's actually that the people were in bondage to Satan, and that they were worshiping demons, and that when they stop worshiping their idols, that they are in a way being freed from bondage to demons, to Satan. Right. And so it's not just about this hunk of wood or this hunk of metal, but it's at a much deeper spiritual level than that. Not that everyone in those countries becomes saved, but it is a real change, that there's not the same level of just superstition, of power, that these people who claim to or do have this connection with these demons, the witch doctors have over them. And it's a real change in those countries.
I mean, the modern practice of science is many unsaved people worshiping a God they don't know, but worshiping his consistency, worshiping the fact that God has ordered the world through their own form of sort of idolatry, right. But without the.
But even then, their idolatry is constrained. One of the things about worshiping the stick, right, is that God talks about how you take half of it and you cut it off and you carve it, and then you bow down and worship that and think that has power, and then you throw the other half in the fire to be burned. How stupid can you be, basically? And God mocks at other times and just says, how foolish, like in Habakkuk 2, 18 and 19. What profit is the image that its maker should carve it? The molten image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it, to make mute idols. Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. And nobody in modern society, right? Again, you can get some areas that have not been impacted by the gospel, that this continues. But in general, most places, there's some very poor places and remote places in India where it's pretty well still embraced, but most are not of the idea that you can carve something and then say it has power. That just, you look at it and it was mocked in Habakkuk, but that doesn't mean that people accepted it. 25 or 500 years later, they were still doing the same thing.
I mean, that was something that Judaism was strange for, because all the nations around them had idols. Most of the nations all over the world had idols, and Judaism didn't. And now Christianity doesn't, or they shouldn't have. They were told not to. The official Judaism, the worship of the true God, the true worship of the true God wasn't idolatrous.
And you look at, though, that's really important to recognize, because you look at Judah had the law, they had the prophets that were saying, don't do this, this is foolishness, but they still thought this was wise. They kept going back to it like a dog returning to its vomit. They kept going back to it until Christ comes, and then they stop. This is the work of Christ in the world, and to pretend like it's not, you read the Old Testament and you'll see that it is.
Yeah, the third one on our list is terrorism shocks the world. When we see these attacks that take place, it's frontline news for, weeks or however long it is, versus this was the expected way of life, not that long ago. You have times of war, and the Bible mentioned where the kings got ready because it was the time of year to go to war. So they went to war, they fought, they killed, and we look at that as very strange and different, yet that was normal. and these constantly attacking everyone and each other, that was to be expected. But now, I mean, we get all up in arms when countries invade countries, even if it has nothing to do with us. We are very concerned about it.
There's just this idea that life is to be protected that is a very Christian idea and doesn't come from any place else. But yet and Islamic nations try to use that against nations that are predominantly or come from a Christian worldview. But still, even in those other nations, they recognize there's a shock to it. They recognize that it works, and they recognize the reason that it works is because people think human lives have value. And so now all of a sudden you can do terrorism and people go, this is a problem. And the whole world will go against, look at Russia invading in Ukraine. A large portion of the world was willing to step up and say, yeah, we're going to cut off all imports, even of oil. In Europe, they were willing to be cold over it. All kinds of things that they were choosing to do because they said this is a terrorist act. And that wasn't how it used to be. Like you said, it used to be people said, it's the time of year to go to war. You didn't have to say, we have a very good reason, a very good, and this goes back to Augustine and his just war theory and all these things that nations now feel like they need to justify it. That wasn't true at the time of David.
And they have to justify it to the people. And I mean, and even I think we're going to separate as we go to the next point, kind of war from, because we kind of separate war from terrorism. And that's kind of the point we're making here is like raping and pillaging. If you went in and attacked the women and the children and took them and captured them when the men were like that, today we don't consider that to be an aspect of war. That is not an appropriate act of war. Whereas back then, that was. And
let's be serious what back then is. Back then is World War II.
Right.
It's not like this enormously long period ago in World War II. There were reasons why the Germans wanted the Americans to come in rather than the Russians. They expected to be raped if the Russians came in. That was largely changed by America in World War II, that expectation changed. This is a new thing.
And so, I mean, but so you have this line that gets crossed in people's mind that now we think of as this sacrosanct thing. Before it was you do whatever if you were poor, you expected anything to be done to you. And you expected those, and you kind of looked at those who had power. And if they didn't do that, you kind of saw it as a sign of weakness.
Right.
And that was how the world operated. And whereas today we say if you have power, there is an expectation. I mean, obviously we see that people don't always use it in the way they should, but they have to lie about it. Before, they didn't even bother lying about it. It was blatant. It was, of course we're going to do these things. Of course we're going to take your wives. Of course we're going to kill your children, probably in front of you. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, it was just, that was the barbarism of the world. And now we go, that's horrible.
And so that's leading right on to number 4, which is the reduction of war. I mean, we're coming off of the 20th century, which, I mean, it's kind of hard to measure, but people would say that, there were record numbers in terms of raw numbers of people who died in war. But
part of that is just a huge increase in population.
Right, yes. Yeah, but you look at like the last few years, since World War II, there's been a lot fewer wars than there have been in other points in history. Like Connor was saying, where you have the kings going out to war, where every year you expect your nation to be involved in a small war with at least one of your neighbors, perhaps more. And that's something that has reduced. It's not, the problem of war has not been solved, and as long as there's sinners, I don't think there's much hope of that ever being solved. But it is something that has become a shameful thing for nations to go and attack each other.
And even when you attack another nation, there's been a new standard set of how you treat the nation that you were attacked. It used to be you attack them to pillage them. Now America in particular, more so than other nations, but we go in and we attack people, and then we send them a huge amount of resources. We rebuild them better than they were before. This is kind of like the historic opposite of why people went to war. And, it says in James 4, 1-4, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and you covet and cannot obtain. You fight in war. Yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, and you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And as you look, I mean, this is what drives wars, but if you look now, like you look at the Kuwait War, you look at the, Gulf War II, you look at all these wars, the United States is sending billions to Ukraine saying, we don't want anything from Ukraine. Europe's spending billions. We don't want anything from Ukraine. They send money to Afghanistan. They send money to, place after place after place where we're not saying we're going in there to pillage them. Instead, what we do is we go to war to reduce resources. So it's not out of the historical lust. We're doing it out of, and there's an element of a sin of pride to say we are the policemen of the world. But this isn't the tradition. So even the wars on both sides, it's not the traditional reason for war, which both sides is just trying to get an advantage on their neighbor.
Right. And I think the other part is when we look at these wars, we forget how they were everywhere. Like you might have even like within nations, within boundaries, like the use of violence against one, like you don't have times where like North Carolina and South Carolina are going to war with each other. You know what I mean? Or if they go to war with each other, it's in totally different ways. We wouldn't even consider them being able to send in and fight each other. We would be like just shocked and appalled at that. Whereas if you lived in an area, there would be violence all around you. You would have no expectation of living through a year or two without having something along those lines happen.
When you hear that Florida is sending in the National Guard after the hurricane to North Carolina, you would take it very differently.
Yes, absolutely.
They see an opportunity to pillage. That's why they're coming.
It's now North Florida.
Right. I mean, it is. I mean, I just so many of the comments that I remember seeing last time had to do with just going, you can't tell that the world has gotten worse, and I'm going, you're talking over such a short time period. I think, the fact that you don't see it is proof that it's come, because you've gotten so used to what you expect that you go, I can't believe it's this bad. And it used to be so much worse.
And another one that is very obvious, that people probably just don't think about at all, is just that animal sacrifice now is basically completely dead. And people talk about religious liberty and how America has such religious liberty. Well, most places in America, and there's some question, is this legal by the Supreme Court? But the law in many places that animal sacrifice is illegal in the United States, which means that the religion that all of our ancestors practiced is illegal in the United States today. And that's something that you can tie directly to the gospel, because why were there animal sacrifices? God commanded animal sacrifices that were pointing to Christ.
And then pretty much all nations did them.
Right. All throughout the world, they were doing sacrifices. And then Christ comes, and then gradually over the next centuries, animal sacrifices now have gone to effectively zero.
And part of it is recognizing as the gospel has gone forth and people have seen the power of the gospel, they recognize the uselessness of animal sacrifices. In Hebrews 10, 4-5, it says, "For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me." When Christ comes and sees, and people actually see that through Christ there is a power over sin, there is a breaking of that, they go, why do burnt offerings anymore? It's stupid. This obviously doesn't work. We've done it all the time and it's never worked. But yet, up until Christ, everybody was doing it, including the Jews.
And that's something that wasn't even wrong for the Jews to do. They were commanded to do it. But then the actual God's law changed, that now they're ended, and they have now been ended.
Right, and it ended throughout the whole world and not just in a local place. And, very related to that is that God told Noah, don't drink blood. But yet, people would drink blood all the time, thinking that because life is in the blood, and they had this sense of life in the blood, if you wanted to be as strong as a lion, you wouldn't drink lion's blood. If you wanted to be, whatever, you would think that you could get the characteristics of that life, of that animal, by drinking the blood. Well, people don't do it in a religious sense. Some people, there's still black pudding and stuff, so I'm not saying nobody consumes blood. But people don't think, well, if I sacrifice this animal, that I'll get their power, whatever that animal power that they had, whatever they're known for, that I'll get it by drinking their blood. That idea has become laughable, where it didn't used to be laughable at all. This used to be a serious thing that people did.
And again, like when the Puritans came to the United States, there was huge amount. I mean, shamanism and beliefs along those lines were incredibly common. And and it's really easy to make, there's this mix of. It's really easy to look at the Indians and call them savages because you're saying they weren't intelligent. They were intelligent, and what they were saying is they were savages, or they were saying they were these things is because of their practices, not because, they were very intelligent people. They had complex cultures in real ways, but their practices was, like Joshua was saying earlier, is they were slaves to sin. They were enslaved to these things. And so where you had cannibalism, or you had animal sacrifice, or you had drinking blood, it didn't mean that these were unthinking people. It didn't mean that they had no sense of anything. They had a sense of man, and a sense of that there's a spiritual thing in the world. But they were enslaved to their worship. And I think that's a real thing that we've lost, is we've forgotten that when Christ said he came to break the power of sin in the world, he's been breaking it in the world in real ways, so that while men are still enslaved to sin, they're not enslaved to the degree that they were. They're not enslaved to the same things that they were.
And the next one, the seventh one, we mentioned it a little bit, is the virtual elimination of cannibalism. And this was something that wasn't in every society in the world, but there were many societies that it was practiced relatively routinely. The eating of other people, whether it's sacrificial victims, whether it is captives in war, and that's something that also has been largely eliminated. Whenever something like that comes out, it's a huge shock that someone would do this, and there were many cultures where that was not shocking. It was normal.
And whether it's your enemies or just that. People had a taste for human flesh. You look at the Aztec Empire. It was, you could go into the store and buy flesh. That was true. They ate human flesh in the Greek Empire even. These things, they were not, we tend to think of them as localized when they were very widespread in the world. And Judaism constrained it in Israel. That's the law constrained eating of human flesh in certain places where there was a Jewish connection, but through the law, but it really gets eliminated largely through the whole world by now, through the spread of Christianity.
Number 8 on the list is the elimination of religious harlotry, or having sexual practices associated with worship. And again, this is one that, you still see it in cults and things like, the Branch Davidians and things like, whenever you see these little cults spring up that there's associated with it. But you go back not that long ago, and this was a major component of many, many religions. Obviously during the Roman Empire, but we think it ended there. No, it just, as the Roman Empire collapsed, it moved. It still existed in many places. What destroyed it was Christianity. And you can see within the Catholic Church where nuns became sort of this. You can look and see how.
The chaste version, quote
right?
unquote.
Because they, there was real abuse and real things that were covered up and hidden, but some of that was also due to shame.
Right, hiding things is inherently because you consider them shameful.
Right, and so I think you just but you do not see where there is this open celebration of come to worship and satisfy your sexual lusts. That this can be done openly, that practicing those sexual acts became a shameful thing, and they were effectively removed. I don't know of any mainstream religion that has that as a practice that is accepted.
And you look at it. As you read the Bible and read about the high places, usually there were prostitutes at the high place. That was part of the worship,
right?
And so you thought that was how you, by fulfilling your animal desires, that this somehow brought you closer to God. And this was the religion that, especially in Baal worship, that it was very associated with those things.
Which is, when you think about Baal worship, was effectively worship of men, which explains why it does come up in cults. When you have a cult that sort of worships and idolizes a man, it becomes very natural for that to spring up, because It's just it's the same exact form.
But look at these people who do things like in that nature, where you constantly have that problem where you have a man that has a megachurch usually, and all of a sudden you find out that he had an affair, and the response is, this is shameful, this is sinful, they need to be put out. Sometimes they cover it up, sometimes they use oblique language and go, oh, he had an inappropriate relationship with the woman, instead of actually saying what went on. But all that is a testimony that there's a level of shame that drives these things. It just simply, the world used to be the opposite. Our ninth is shame of sodomy. And as we look at our culture and we see the rise of sodomy, it's really easy to look short term and go, there's no shame of sodomy. But the reality is there's an active working to turn us back to having no shame of sodomy. But if you go back 2,000 years ago, you go back to the Greek, the Greek view was for a man to lay with a woman was shameful, for a man to lay with a man was virtuous and was strengthening. And so, this is where we were, where they were intentionally teaching that for a man to lay with a woman, that this was breeding and that you have to do it, but it's you acting like an animal. But if you lay with a man, that's normal. And so the world has shifted. And even though right now we're looking, especially in America and in Europe, there's this push to try to shift it back, we should still recognize how far it moved in the first place.
Oh, I don't know of anywhere in the United States where it's considered to be normal for a person to be homosexual. You know what I mean? Which is what you're saying with the Greek, that it, I don't know of anywhere where that is the view. What we're shocked at is just the acceptance of it. Yeah, which is, you know what I mean? Which is still so massively far from where it was.
I think even to add to all of that is look at the push. They're pushing this in their faces, in the public, in the school systems, everywhere you see online. Accept us. We are doing right. We're good. And they keep throwing it at us. And that shows that there's something wrong with it. If they have to keep throwing it in your face and keep doing these things and keep being aggressive and on the attack, they know it's shameful.
Right. The most you're going to get is people going, hey, just let people do what they want to do. But you don't see the average man going, yeah, we're going to be homosexuals.
Right.
And like I said, like you said, if the sin continues, it will get worse in the United States. God will let that become worse. He will turn more people over to a debased mind. But we act like this state is worse than it's ever been. It's not even remotely close to touching as worse as it's ever been. And I think that's, and so you can see that there can be a decline in a cyclical decline in a country or in a part of the world, it might even affect a large part of the world. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden that you can go and ignore what the trend has been for 2,000 years.
And even just the short-sightedness of it all, reading through the Kings and the Chronicles. Like, there was a righteous king who loved God. The people followed God, at least, openly, not with their hearts or externally. And then he dies, someone wicked comes. Then there's a complete shift. There's no reason to say that this is just a fad that's going to last for another 15 years. And then God changes the heart of men. We're so short-sighted when we think of these things. We look at, since the 70s or whenever obviously it's gotten a lot more popular since 2015, but, the sexual revolution, it can change back so quickly. It changed quickly. There's no reason to think it can't change back just as fast.
And you look through all the kings, right? And I think it's only Josiah is the only one that drove the homosexuals out of the land, even though God told them to before that. And then, like you said, he dies and they come right back.
Right back, yeah.
But think about that compared to what's happened now is people just don't accept sodomy as normal. Right. And even though, we're in a season where it's growing in acceptance, it doesn't mean it's going to grow very far. And it doesn't mean that the gospel's not going to end up causing light's going to shine again, and then people will want to retain knowledge of God, and then it will disappear. Or not disappear, but greatly diminish. And we see this, we're kind of like the opposite place of where we were during the book of Kings, where finally somebody does something about it, and then it's gone, and it's gone for the rest of the time. You only have this one short instance where you have some idea that sodomy's been dealt with, as opposed to now you see a continual increase of dealing with sodomy, except for little blips like we're in the middle of now.
We've dealt with a number of things with an increase of kind of the shame of sin and how God has increased man's shame towards sin. And now we're going to shift and start dealing with looking at the other thing we wanted to focus on, which is the increase of order. And again, one of the things I think it's worth pointing out is I think it's really easy to separate an increase of order from righteousness. And it's really worth making this distinction. When you make things more orderly, it doesn't eliminate sin completely. But the point is order does not arise from darkness. Sin and darkness do not create order. And so you can use order to sin with. You can cause something to be more orderly, but it is not the sin that causes the order to come. And the order makes it easier to manage sin, it makes it easier to see sin, and it makes it easier to deal with sin. And so it's really important. I think it's so easy to go, well, I'm just not going to give, I don't want to give God glory for something that clearly came from him. That's sinful. And it's evil for the church not to notice that. And so as we go through these things, just it's worth thinking, how have I divorced the bringing of order from God's righteousness? When it says the increase of his government shall know no end, a part of that government is the increase of order and order in the world.
And even when we think about it, we think of light and darkness, right? I mean, Jesus Christ said he's the light that came into the world, right? That in the, out of the darkness came the great light. And you look at that and recognize that without light, you can't get order.
Right.
If you told your children to go clean their room and then turned off all the lights and threw them in there, you would not really expect them to make progress.
Right.
There has been real progress made in order, and that's because God has increased the light in the world through Jesus Christ.
I mean, and so, just to kind of underscore that, I mean, because King Solomon was a picture of Christ and of Christ's reign, in the Old Testament, you have this passage where the Queen of Sheba comes to visit, and in 1 Kings 10, 4-7, it recounts that. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard." And so, I mean, I think what's really, when you look at this, I mean, the things it focuses on, it's all things that are related to the order of Solomon's household, to the way that, down to the way his people were dressed, to the way they served the table, to the way he went up. I mean, this is one ruler looking at another ruler's kingdom and going, I know how hard it is to impose order and to think of these things and create these things. And so, I mean, when you look at that, and when you look at what God decided to highlight about that passage, we should recognize order is nothing. It's nothing to diminish. It's something to actually look at and recognize, and the church needs to glorify God for what he's done in the world.
So one way that the world's become more ordered is through just the idea of written languages. So you read about missionaries that are going to these countries, and where they're uncivilized, at least. They need the Christian influence in their civilization to reform it. And one of the first things they have to do after they try to get them to put clothes on and stop sacrificing to demons and stop worshiping idols. But one of the other big things that they do most places that they go is to give them a written language. Because many countries do not have or did not have a written language. They did not have the idea of writing. Even some societies that were relatively sophisticated, like some of the South American societies, where they built very impressive things, they did not have the ability to write things down, and that's something that is, just a massive thing in in society to be able to record things, pass them on from person to person, generation to generation. And even today, you have people going out trying to bring the Bible to some of these tribes that with a few people speaking the language, and they're still having to create these written languages because there's still languages that do not have it.
And I think you look now, and I believe that most of the written languages in the world were actually produced by Christian missionaries. Not like by number of people that like English wasn't, but even there it was greatly impacted by the spread of the gospel.
Right, in the terms of count of languages,
in the count of
speakers.
languages. And that's really remarkable. And just the idea of how much you can transform a society by allowing people to communicate, allowing people to be able to write something that then somebody else can read, and you can communicate where these societies, it is impressive what the Aztecs built, but it's, without a written language, but how much more efficient and how much more productive can a society be through a written language?
And directly connected to that is literacy, because other places had a written language, but very few people knew how to read. And the idea that now, virtually everyone can read to some level, how good of a level that is up for debate. But that drastic increase in literacy can usually be traced to people saying you need to read the Bible. So it's the spread of Christianity is saying you need to know how to read so that you can read the Bible and hear from God.
A lot of these things, they didn't make that much progress except in a limited community until you have the Reformation. And at the Reformation, when you discover or rediscover the doctrine of priesthood of believers, all of a sudden reading gets to be a really serious thing, where in Roman Catholicism it never was. It was, not after the 4th or 5th century. So again, this is something that goes up and down. The literacy in America was much better if you go back 200 years than it is now, but still the general trend is very much upward.
And even with that, as a counter argument people will have is the literacy rate in America is dropping, and even the quality of how much that person can read is significantly dropping. And that's because of the rejection of the gospel. People are not making the connections that I need to read so I can understand the Bible better. Now people, watching more videos on YouTube, watching more, wasting their time doing other things versus, reading things. So they're just the lack of wanting to read and having a need to read is dropping. It isn't, but in their minds it is. And then you have the public schools that are really dumbing down what is considered being literate.
So basically our message is unsubscribe.
Exactly.
Turn off YouTube. Uninstall YouTube.
You see that? Click the unsubscribe button right down.
Unring the bell.
As long as you're going to start reading the Bible more, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
On your way to work, bring a book as you're driving down the road.
But even in 1 Peter 2, it talks about how when you're saved that you desire the word of God like a baby desires its mother's milk. And that's what God says he does. But because of the light that Christianity spreads to a society, that causes the society to want to be literate, even though the only people that are really driven to be literate are those who are truly saved.
And so we add as a separate point, but it's very much connected, is the Bible being translated and available almost through the entire world. There's people who keep track of how many languages don't have a Bible, and there are some, but virtually everyone on the planet, outside of a very small language with a very small number of speakers, they all have the Bible that they can read, or they have a Bible that if they can read, they could read.
And like we've talked about, all of those points, literacy, written language, and the Bible being translated, those are all just so closely related together. I think we've done a number of episodes where we've talked about how the Bible being translated caused languages to be solidified and to be standardized, caused nations to be transformed to the point where, now the way that we think of languages existing is so different than we would have 500 years ago, even 300 years ago in a lot of places. I think in Nigeria and places like that, there's been real shifts in the last several hundred years in how... Less
than that. You're talking about 120 years, maybe.
Right.
And and you just look at it again, as soon as Luther starts to, says, the people need the Bible, he starts to have a school that he starts to teach people how to read because the common people didn't know how to read. Calvin, the same thing. He starts to teach people how to read. And so the idea of the literacy and getting a Bible that they can read, because they were always joined together. Luther translates the Bible. There's the French translation that comes out through Geneva. There's, English translations that come out, Italian translation. I mean, the Reformation and this idea that everybody should read. I mean, that is from the gospel and the spread of the true gospel, as opposed to Roman Catholicism, which says you can express everything with pictures. And yes, we're headed back there, but it doesn't mean that we didn't take huge steps forward first. So much so that instead of saying 1% of the people maybe could read, if you're a king or a priest, maybe you can read. Now it's kind of shocking that we only have an 80% literacy rate or whatever we have.
Number 12 on the list is property ownership. And I mean, while property ownership has existed throughout the history of the world in different degrees, I mean, Abraham bought a cave, came back, years later, and that was still recognized that he owned it. There have been, a lot of places you had to be wealthy to own property. You had to have some sort of power to be able to maintain the property that you owned. Whereas today, I mean, we consider, the level of record keeping. You look at even like in England, where they would keep, they would carve the staves and the different things that they could put together to show who owned what. And I mean, they had all these different methods of record keeping. All of that has the level of order and level of information that can be recorded, can be maintained, and how it can be regulated. The things that we take for granted today, even though we have taxation on the property, the idea of people owning the property is just completely standard. We expect it to be true that you can buy a piece of property, you can own it, and everyone who can know you own it, and there should not be any problems with that whatsoever. That has not been true for much of the history of the world. And
that it doesn't need to be by your power that you maintain it, and by your strength. And, you look and this is, again, this is a relatively new concept that you have this throughout the world. And it is largely throughout the world that people have the right to own their own property. If you don't consider men made in the image of God so that they have value, if they don't have value, then there is no property. And so it starts with this understanding of who man is, that man was created in the image of God, and that he's not just this animal like a dog that you can eat or you can do whatever you want to. Notice how I chose a dog. That's because I come from Springfield, Ohio. So when you don't consider man to have any value, then obviously he can't own property. So it's by strength, it's by position, it's by these other things. And then, but as soon as you start to have this view that man has value, then all of a sudden the fact that he has value means he can now possess value. Right. And so it really is from the gospel that you start to say that man has some worth that means that he could own something of worth.
We've forgotten the fact of even the history when Thomas Jefferson wrote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that the common phrase that was at that time was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was, and that
it was just life, liberty, and property.
But I mean that those things were carved into that was something that people were going, that God had
that was endowed, so shockingly new.
Right. That God had endowed man with this right to do these things. And so, and
it comes from the fact that God had made man, and his image is why you could own property. Right. And so as that spreads through the world, property ownership becomes a normal thing.
Right, which is, now people are always complaining, all the Europeans came in and stole all the Indians' land. Like, well, who came up with the idea that a nation that's stronger shouldn't go in and steal other people's land or take other people's land? Why is that stealing to do that? You're saying that it's the evil Christians coming to do this to the poor Indians. Well, if you adopt the Indian philosophy, why would you even say that if they're stronger, who's to stop them?
Another one that we have is the 13th one is written law. And written law is a different order than happened before. And even you look at English common law, and a lot of their law isn't written. But more and more nations are going to written laws. You have Napoleon and the Napoleonic Code, which is a written law. You start to develop these law systems. And some are closer to God's law system, some are further away. But a consistency in law helps you build a society in an incredibly significant way, because it means that there's real bounds on people, that's based on the law, and that it's not just some arbitrary opinion.
Right, being able to refer to things. obviously this is building on literacy and written language. You know what I mean? That
Right.
you can write it down, that you can have an expectation that people can read what you wrote down, and that what you wrote is going to persist, that they can come back to it later, make arguments about it. I mean, it, like you said, it's the British Empire had a lot of it was oral law. Even today, there's sections of it that are still maintained as sort of an oral tradition. And so, I mean, we can't even say that that every nation has embraced this, but every nation now, even within the Britain's oral tradition, they go back and they look at things that people wrote down about the oral tradition, which is impacting how they view it.
And you look like at a country like Nigeria, where they are writing laws based on what England says that their non-written law is, because there's enough case law and stuff that they can
Right.
actually write laws that are reflective of
Right.
the British oral system or the common law system, which was really the idea of you just judge according to common sense. But that really doesn't work. You really need to have written law so that people can understand how they should judge and how to judge righteously. And so a written law where the ruler doesn't just go, I like this person, so therefore X, and I don't like this person, so therefore Y. And we see in America, it's not perfect. There's a reason why all the January 6th defendants are all being tried in D.C., because they know that they'll handle law differently than if they were tried in other states. There's no question a lot of them would have gotten off if it was tried in different states, but not in D.C. But the exception proves the rule, not the other way around. The fact that we have written law really matters because they have to work around the fact that we have written law.
Right.
And that really, again, that comes from the gospel, and you see it with the picture of Christ, the picture of Moses, right? That's really the first written law, the Ten Commandments, but also Deuteronomy and Exodus and Leviticus. But Deuteronomy 17:18-20 says, also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Having a written law gives you a continuity of societies, of cultures. It gives you a continuity of states. It gives you constraints on the king. It gives you all these things that are incredibly useful for nations to be prosperous. I remember even when the Soviet Union fell, the USSR, and everybody's going, oh, they've got capitalism now. Capitalism will solve all their problems. It didn't solve any of their problems. The reason it didn't solve any of their problems is they didn't have any real written law. They didn't have contracts that mattered. There was nothing to say that judges had to judge a certain way. They would just ignore it. I look at the destruction that happens in Nigeria and the poverty in Nigeria. And one of the big reasons of the poverty in Nigeria is because they have a written law in form. They just don't have a written law in fact. And if you don't have a written law in fact, it creates real shortages, real problems. And the world's a lot better off with the written law, and the written laws have been increasing for the last 2,000 years.
I mean, number 14 is related to this in a sense, but I mean, it doesn't have to be, because you can go back and see, like, ancient laws where they had, like with the Medes and the Persians, where once the king made a law, it couldn't be changed. But the application of this that we're actually taking is that the rulers are subject to the law, that the ruler isn't above the law. And you could, Samuel Rutherford and Lex Rex, and, the idea that the law constrains even kings. And this is something that is pretty new in a lot of ways. I mean, like I said, there have been civilizations that had this idea. They were very rare. The idea that in most nations today, the ruler has to be subject to the law. And even in nations where they fight about it, that's what kind of comes out, is they have to go to war with their own populace and with their own, there's an expectation that, hey, this should apply to you. This isn't just for us. These are the laws of the land. You have to live by them.
And when there's a coup, that's usually the basis of it, is that that the leader is refusing to obey the law, and
Right.
we're going to come in, and frequently the people that are overthrowing them, they'll disobey the law the same way as the current leader did. But they're making that argument as to that's why you should join with us, is because we'll be law abiding.
Right. I mean, and even in cases where there are overthrows and things like that. I mean, like it was during the Civil War. I mean, that was one of the things that the Union had to deal with. The Union said you can't leave. And so then they had to recognize the fact that if they said you can't leave, then they can't say that the states actually left. You know what I mean? And you kind of have this,
and they impeached, Andrew Johnson over that, basically.
Right.
Of are they in or are they out? Because all of a sudden they're inconsistent with their written law.
Right.
And again, Deuteronomy 17 is very clear. This comes from God. This comes from God's instruction to Moses, but it doesn't really take off in the world until Christ comes and until Christ is ruling the nations.
So one big trend that's pretty obvious over the last few hundred years in particular is the near complete elimination of monarchies. There's very few countries that have a king who has any real power. And this is something that we can tie to Christ as well. We can look at the Old Testament where God told Israel, when you're choosing a king, you're rejecting me as king. And somehow people take the fact that Israel had kings as saying that Christian countries should have kings, when in fact God specifically says, you're rejecting me when you have a king. But, you look now and when you have Christ is appointed as king of the world, and so the lesser kings, it makes sense that they are not going to continue to reign. They're not going to continue to claim that. In many times they claim divinity, that they were gods, they were kings and gods. So now, no, you're definitely not saying you're a god, and now you're lucky to have any political power at all if you're still a king.
And you look, right, and it's really easy to go, oh, that was a long time ago. Well, in the 40s, the Japanese Empire said emperor said that he was a god. I mean, this isn't like this. This has been declining over time. It's been weakening over time. You go back to the Magna Carta, you go back to other things, and you see a pattern that Christianity has been weakening it, and now it's largely destroyed. You don't. Occasionally you get a strong man that comes in for a little while, but he usually comes in at the request of the people, and they're not going to set up a dynasty that goes year after year, generation after generation. It just doesn't happen anymore.
Right. You're more likely to get periodic dictatorships than you are any sort of like kings where like you're talking about where it persists.
Where it's generational.
Number 16 on our list is scientific advancement. As the gospel goes forward, there is just this desire to have a better understanding of who God is, and that comes from his creation, of seeing the different things, whether it's studying the body, whether it's studying space or the things around us, the rocks, studying what he has created and what he has done, and how we can combine all these things. So like with doctrine, all things go together, and how God has his world created, all these things go together. We can find healing from the things that God has planted in the ground. We can look inside of our bodies and see healing, and that's a huge thing that has increased as the gospel's gone forward. It's something that diseases that killed people not long ago is like it's such an easy cure for it. We don't even consider it. Certain diseases that were wiping out civilizations.
And I mean, the world is created to give glory to God. Mm-hmm. It's created to be beautiful. It's created to be useful to men. And so the more that we understand the world, the better we understand God, and the more comfortable lives that we live. And, there's so many things that are understood today far better than they were even 50 years ago, 100 years ago. There's just an incredible amount of scientific understanding and of not just theoretical, but actually applied to people's lives and helping people in really real ways.
And it's really important to recognize that scientific advancement is founded on one thing, that God is a God of order. If you believe in fairies in the woods, or if you believe in the Roman gods, or you believe in the Greek gods that are all random and have, even if you believe in Allah, who is largely random in a lot of ways, there's no such thing as assurance of salvation in Islam. If you look at any God that's about randomness, it eliminates any reason to do science. If God is completely fickle and can do whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it, you can't have science. So scientific advancement is based on the idea that God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. And that is the foundation of all science. is the nature of God. And so you can't, so 2,000 years ago, people didn't even try to do these things in a lot of ways because they went, why bother? Who knows what he's going to do? How can we know? Maybe Thor will get upset. Oh, well, that will change how everything works in the world. And then Christianity comes and goes, no, God's a God of order. God actually is not random. He's not fickle. He's saying take dominion. Taking dominion, that commandment alone is a statement that God is a God of order, which is the basis of scientific advancement.
And the atheistic ideas that are flourishing now destroy it from another angle because the world is still, there's no meaning to it, there's no order to it. It's just order coming from chaos, which doesn't really work, so everything is chaotic. So why does it matter if you understand things better? You probably aren't going to get any insight anyway.
And it ends up that if it's, the postmodernism idea of my opinion makes it true, well, that's basically atheism. That's my opinion, so it's true. Well, that means you can't measure anything, you can't do anything, you can't figure out anything. Now, they all steal from the Christian worldview, so that they do, but the reality is if they were consistent with their own theology, they would go, we can't know anything. Why bother?
I think one of the real big mistakes that I think Christians make when they think about the history of the world is they think that the removal from paganism was purely a function of knowledge. And there's this part of it where what Christ said was, hey, if you want to spoil someone's house, you bind the strong man and you do this. And so I think there is no reason why it just is a shift of knowledge that caused such a shift in the world. There was so much more darkness in the world. There was so much less light. And people were enslaved to the worship of gods and false gods and demons. Christ broke some of that. Christ began to break that up so that people actually could see things that they could not see before. And I think there's this part of it where, the reason why the world seemed so much more uncertain before was because of that darkness and because of the confusion that was caused by the forces of darkness reigning in the world. And so when that ends, it's not just that all of a sudden there was this tipping point in knowledge, because I think it requires, people think, oh, men just suddenly change. Suddenly we begin to know things. That doesn't work. There had to be a force in the world that actually changed the way men could understand things, and it wasn't in their minds. It was the world changed itself.
And the tipping point where we see all of a sudden there's this rapid increase in knowledge and being able to do things in scientific research and things like that, because it is dramatically increased. You really have to wait for theology to percolate through before you can do that.
Yep.
Because as long as people are still going, well, I'll make my sacrifice to this demon of the woods, and that's how I'll get it, that's how I'll know if it's going to rain tomorrow.
Right.
Then you can't make scientific advancement. You have to defeat the theology before you can go, no, here's the real theology. Here's the truth of the world, how the world is organized. So therefore, you can look and say, okay, I see the radar shows that there was storms out in Tennessee yesterday, so that means we might get storms today, or likely to, right? There's these things that all of a sudden you go, there's an order to the universe, where before you first have to accept that theologically before you can start to use the scientific advancements, or that that they become widespread and people put the resources necessary to develop them.
And there's a reason why when you saw science really begin to advance, there was a phrase that people would use that theology was the queen of the sciences. And, there was this, because there was, I think, a distinct recognition between them that what caused people to be able to think about these things was the understanding of God and who God was, that the forces of the world and of darkness were being put under its feet, and you could actually begin to think about things.
And one thing related to this is a way the world's gotten better is even just the idea that we have people that their whole job is to just study the world God made.
Yep.
And there's people, and we could criticize academia a lot, but just the idea that that people are devoted to that they spend their whole life studying birds or studying, how particles that years ago we didn't even know existed, how they move. And it's just, the fact that people are doing that they're studying it, they're making these advancements is a way that the world is still advancing and is still learning more about God's world and attaching value to it and saying, that this is that there is order in creation, that it's good for us to understand it. And so let's study it and learn new things about it.
And a lot of them are doing that with the basis to overthrow God, which is, some of it is self-mocking, just like the people who used to carve a statue and then bow down and think that statue had power, right? I mean, the geologists, a lot of them are going out there and they're saying all these layers exist, and so therefore there must not be a God, that this took billions of years and all this other stuff. So, but they're still looking at creation to attempt to prove that, and they're still saying that the creation, the world that exists, it's worth examining because it matters and it's significant, as opposed to before people went, you can't find anything from nature. So, this seems like the right time to plant, so we'll plant. And other than that, there isn't that much understanding of how nature works.
And this is something that, if you go back to the verge of modern science or the early days, that it was driven by churchmen, by whether it's priests or monks, or Reformed theologians. Often these were the people who were also the leading scientists, and you have that close connection between scientific advancement and Christianity.
And then another one that is our number 18, which is medicines. And medicines is kind of a cross between these, right? Because God says that man has value because he's made in his image. And then you have the scientific advancement and this understanding of how things work and this understanding. So all of a sudden, we forget how typically through the history of the world, I mean, like a third of the people dying before they're teenagers, that wasn't unusual. That would be kind of low, actually. And then all of a sudden, like, you look at the shocking discovery of antibiotics and you look at how much that changed the health, like the differences in war after antibiotics is found before it's found. I mean, it's just staggering. Most people in most wars throughout the history of the world have died from disease and not from other things. And so now all of a sudden you have antibiotics, and this just makes a huge shift. And it comes from saying that, yes, the world's orderly and people matter. And between the two of those, all of a sudden you start to say, so how do we heal people?
And you look at the COVID vaccine. Sorry.
And it doesn't mean that people don't abuse it. It doesn't mean that people don't want to play God with it. But at the same time, generally it's moving forward at an enormous rate that's just really quite remarkable.
And medicine's a really good one to kind of show that there's how much overlap there is, because the last episode we did a lot of focus on dominion and taking dominion. And there's this part of it where there's an intersection here between that God, if you look at the amount of death in the world that used to exist in many areas, you don't just get rid of it because men decided to try to get rid of death. It has to be that God is saying, you have to take, if there's death in the world, you have to take it back to righteousness. So, if you're eliminating death, there is an element of righteousness involved with it. And so there's this part of it where taking dominion in the world, that there was a certain amount of death in the world because man was not taking dominion. And so, you really start to see these things start to come together, that Christ's coming, Adam was told to go in the world and take dominion. Christ is the second Adam. And there was a limit to how far fallen man could go. And Christ comes and he allows man to go farther than they would have been able to go, and allows them to do things that begins ending death in real ways. I mean, it's like you said, it's you cannot separate those things from God coming and causing light to be in the world. You cannot attribute that to the work of Satan.
And kind of related to medicines, although somewhat of a different subject, but not a separate point, which is that you look in the theological understanding that it's not what goes into a man that defiles a man, but what comes out of a man that defiles a man. That has dramatically changed health, right? The idea of sewers and septic systems. And this is last 120 years that these things became prevalent, 130 years, something like that. And that shift just has such a huge change in health for people. And it does come back to a theological understanding that what comes out of you is defiling. And so you should put it underground. You should hide it. Like the Bible says that you should take a spade and you should cover up your waste, because that will actually mean that God can be in the midst of you, that life can become saved, and that you can work to put death to death.
Which is an overlap between both technological advancement and shame of sin, because so it's all of these things really do layer on top of each other.
So 19 is one that we've touched on a little bit before, but the counterpoint to medicines is that people aren't going to witch doctors anymore. Instead, they're not seeking after cures from demons and people who have demonic influence, but instead they are looking and saying, we're going to use the medicines that are that are created by people who believe the world is orderly, and they're generally not going to go say we need to sacrifice to the local demon to get healing.
Right. And even the witch doctors, which I would argue that we did an episode on homeopathy, that's pretty much witch doctor. But the witch doctors who think that it's the electrical charges in your body that you need to adjust and you put magnets on because that will change it. And the witch doctors that we have in America, because we still have witch doctors, but they all say they have to use a scientific explanation. This is a real advancement of the gospel and it is a real shift, because Nigerian, they still kill animals. I know somebody where they did human sacrifice of. And so they're still doing that in some places, but as the gospel spreads, even the witch doctors go, we have to give an explanation that's based on the order of the world.
Which allows you to repudiate them. You know what I mean?
Right, which allows you to go, no, you can't tell the difference between this vial of water versus this vial that you hit on the table 200 times. That there's no difference between the two. It's both water.
Right. There's falsification of it. There's all these different things that can be done, because otherwise they have to just go, oh, all my scientific explanation meant nothing. It's just magic.
But if they don't come with a scientific explanation, now people just reject them out of hand. That's how much it's advanced. This is one that's near and dear to me, having gone to many poor countries in the world. And
for more than one reason.
You can now travel overseas to some of the poorest countries in the world, like a country like Nigeria, and your cell phone works. And it's really easy to go, well, no, that's not that big of a difference. But you realize that it means that they have to have consistent electric power. It means that you have to have shipping. It means that you have to have communication so that you're orderly across countries to do this. I mean, the level, the thousands and thousands and thousands of parts that are required to be able to do this, that you can take a cell phone from America and you show up in Nigeria and it works. I mean, the level of order in our society, there wasn't any small community that had that level of order even 100 years ago. And now we think this is normal worldwide, so that we were in Western North Carolina and the cell tower goes out and it's like, how can we communicate with anybody? Well, that's how most of the world was until 50 years ago.
Right.
That nobody could really communicate unless they got on, they started walking down the road and talked to the person. And this is a level of order that is beyond, the sophistication of the order that's required to be able to do that. It means that governments have to cooperate with each other. It means that, so many different elements all need to work together to do it. And yet you can fly over, you turn off your phone, turn it back on in a foreign country, and it starts working.
And it requires the literacy and the written word.
Right. Because, all those other things are required to have that communication, to have the contract.
People to do it.
You have to have law so you can write a contract so that people will trust the other side will keep their contract, so therefore that they'll actually do it with you, because without law, this is such, you look at a cell phone and you just have to recognize how much this is from the gospel.
And it's so widespread, if you're wandering in the Sahara Desert and the camel train comes up to you, those guys have cell phones. They can make calls. It's very widespread.
Number 21 is an increase in the standard of living. Again, I don't think we have any sense of how well off the poor in most of the world are today. There are poor people in America who have more benefits and amenities than kings 150 years ago.
Most poor in America have air conditioning. Nobody had air conditioning 100 years ago, basically. Right. There were a few, but
it's just, like you talked about, like there's very few people in America who don't have a cell phone. There's very few people in America who don't have internet. There's very few people just the level of things that they have. And it doesn't mean that they don't have things that they complain about and that they don't like. Their benefits are, it's just, you can't even think about how the benefits that they have.
And you look at like China. China is pretty much, 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot of starvation in China, and it's pretty much been eliminated now. You look at Russia and the USSR, they had starvation every year. They kept having to come up with their plans that were based on the idea of ownership of property, right? This Christian concept, they had to keep going back to it because they thought they could rebel against God's order. And it kept killing people and starving people. And now you look and starvation is unbelievably reduced to where it was even 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, the strives in this, and God says in Proverbs 13:23, much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of justice there is waste. And so as there is a written law, as there is standards, as people are held accountable to things, all of a sudden there's plenty of food. Because the issue is it's not how God made the world that causes people to starve. It's that people won't act justly that causes people to starve. But through Christ, the world is acting far more just than it did 50 years ago, but especially far more just than it did 2,000 years ago, because there's real progress being made. And that's demonstrating itself that the fallow ground of the poor is not, it's producing a lot more food, so you have a lot fewer starving people, even though the population of the world has increased dramatically over the last 100 years.
Yeah, and that's the next point, that starvation is effectively eliminated. I mean, you still do sometimes have famines, but the only way that there's been a famine is, either war, or that you have a country where there's a famine and all the richer countries send in food, but the government steals it all so the people don't get it. I mean, if other than those like blatant injustice, there would be no starving.
Or they do a COVID lockdown, which also produced some starvation. But it's government intervention that's creating starvation. It's not the order of society.
And I mean, you see those banners on the highway, like 1 in 4 kids goes hungry every day in the U.S. It's like, I mean, and there are people who are on drugs who treat their children really poorly, but the idea that we're pretending like in the U.S. there's a problem with starvation compared to nearly every society in history, where every year you're like, I hope my crops don't fail, otherwise I don't know what I'm going to eat come spring next year. I mean, just the idea that we're pretending like we have a starvation problem in the country.
And the reality is the poor in the United States have higher obesity rates than basically any other society in the world. That's not a sign of being hungry. That's not a sign of 1 in 4 starving. That's a sign of gluttony and far too much food.
Right. When they say that there are people who children go to bed hungry, I mean, that if they ask them if they wanted food, they would say yes. And some, that happens. And then the other part is like you said in the past, today in America, if you're willing to beg, there is no problem with getting food. When you were talking about in the past, there was no one to beg to.
And that child that goes hungry, right? And then they go to school on the next morning and they get fed, and then they get fed lunch. They've had 2 meals. They're hungry because they didn't have 3 meals, as opposed to throughout the history of the world. A lot of people only had 1 meal a day, and they were happy to get that.
Right. That's what I mean, is you were just literally asking, if you said, would you want food? The kids would say yes. That's their criteria fundamentally, is that the kid would say, yes, I would like food if you have it. Not, is the kid starving? Which is a fundamentally different thing. And
I mean, I don't know these organizations in detail, but the criteria is, what standard can I use that makes a billboard that will get money to my organization? I mean, that's the real criteria.
Right. And I mean, like I said, and I think your point earlier about the fact that almost in all of these cases, it's not a lack of food. There's either some
lack of justice.
Right.
Very related to starvation being eliminated, because now there are studies that show that if you're hungry as a child, that greatly diminishes your lifespan. But all these other things, medicine, I mean, you look at the lifespan now, and for a long time in the history of the world, the average person, especially if you have a third of them dying before puberty, the average age was pretty low. It was like 40 or something. And it doesn't mean that people didn't live to 80. They always did. But even now, it's not that unusual to live to 90, 95, 100. I mean, the better we feed our children, the better we have medicine and all these other things, we are causing a real extension of life. And when you read the Bible, it talks about that this is one of the effects of the gospel, that you'll have somebody die at 100 years and you'll say they died as a child.
Right. President Jimmy Carter was the first president to live to be 100, I think. Every president you would consider to be on the upper to be the upper class in most cases in society. And so, I mean, the fact that this is the first one to live to 100 should tell you. I mean, that gives you some idea as to where the curve is and how it exists. Is that we're starting to hit that curve. I mean,
and there's no question that it is sin that causes so much death, right? Because I think over the last 2 or 3 years, or maybe even longer than that, there's been a couple year reduction in the average life expectancy of Americans, especially American males, and it's almost all because of fentanyl and all because of opioid use and the death that's caused by that. And so, sodomy, typically that produces like a 30-year shorter lifespan. I mean, sin has a real effect.
Mortality as well, which is kind of interesting. I mean, and so.
But that might even be tied to the drug use of the mothers. And,
sure.
And so, but as we look and we see those kind of things, we should recognize that even though we're seeing it decrease a little bit, that's because it has so dramatically increased over the last 100 years. I mean, it is really shocking how much it's increased. And as we embrace sin more and more as a society, we should expect it to go down. But what we should do instead in the church is like actually preach the gospel, actually preach truth, actually preach that God's ways are good, instead of going, the law is this evil thing, this burden that nobody should bear, which is so often preached. But when you preach that law is good, that extends the lifespan. 24 is acceptance of international law. And there is, in Christian circles, there's this, there'll be one world government, blah, 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 blah. And the reality is there is one world government. That's what it says in Matthew 25, that all authority was given to Christ on heaven and earth, and he's ascending. But the manifestation of that is that there are real agreements that people allow you can ship from one place to another. Everybody agrees that there's a 12-mile border around your property, so that when China all of a sudden starts to make these artificial islands, that nations rise up and go, this is against law. That there's an agreement by many nations that accept that these are the laws. And that's a great way to reduce war, right? Because if you kind of all accept that these are the rules, then you reduce war, and that's one of the reasons that wars have reduced. But there really is a sense of international law. I'm not for the International Criminal Court and all that stuff.
Right.
That's shifting too far. But to say that nations can join together and say these are common policies, and it usually is done by the more powerful nations, and the weaker nations need to submit. But the U.S. and other nations like Britain that are pushing those things, they aren't doing them that much for their own advantage. It's more a general advantage because there's more order and there's more understanding of international law.
Right. What you're kind of almost comparing it to was before there were police officers, if someone stole something on the street, the people would go, hey, that's wrong, and they would pursue kind of bringing that person to justice. There's a sense where in the world, the nations kind of go, hey, we have this recognition that if somebody takes something, we shouldn't say that's okay. We should all recognize that that's wrong. We should recognize that we do have, there's this
right, that there's real borders, and that you allow people to control stuff. But a lot of these things are pretty serious. Like you look at overfishing. Overfishing was a big problem, and the nations came together and they all said, okay, here's the fishing level that we'll allow. And that's had like real restocking of oceans and stuff. I mean, it's easy to look and see how horrible it can be if certain things happen, right? Where you're actually looking at the UN ruling the world. Nobody's advocating for that. But
Nobody here anyway.
Right. But we should also recognize that the fact that nations can agree on laws has a huge benefit to the world.
Paris Climate Accords.
We can see places where it abuses it for the sake of accruing power. So, but at the same time, there's fish when almost, some species of fish were almost wiped out as a way, as a food source, because people were overfished and people agreed.
Right, and those are biblical principles where you look in Scripture and it talks about if you're killing an animal and the animal has eggs or has babies there, you should leave that alone, because Scripture was looking at allowing things to continue in a. You wanted sustainability
for your neighbor, right? You have laws that were required for neighbors, and the international law I'm talking about is where we've now extended those things to nations.
Right.
Don't move the ancient landmarks that within a certain number of miles from your shore, that's your territory, and outside is not. And I mean, these are all principles that are individually applicable to individuals that nations have now taken these and used them in a good way and a productive way in the world.
And that kind of leads into point number 25, which is basically the arguments that is often made today is not from the principle of we have authority, we can do whatever we want. They actually
we not authority, but we have power.
That we have this right. Because we have more guns than you, you have to listen to us. They're actually making more arguments along reasoned lines or along the idea that there is truth and that there are principles that can be applied. And yes, there are plenty of times where people do things and still say might makes right, but the standard way of making the argument is not that way. The way that they make the argument is actually, hey, there are truths that need to be applied to the world, and that there's good and there's evil, and there's that you're promoting life is good. Even though they turn around and promote abortion, even though they turn around and do all these things, the nature of the argument is not we have power, we can do whatever we want.
Right. When Sennacherib came up to Jerusalem, he says, "I've conquered all these nations. I'm going to conquer you."
Right.
When Putin goes to Ukraine, he says, "I need to free these oppressed Russians who live in your land." It's a very different argument.
Right. And even you look at like Putin's nuanced argument, it's also, I need a buffer between me and people who will destroy my, you know what I mean? That, which is
right.
Again, that's a very different argument than I can do whatever I want to. It's
And Putin also very openly goes, and of course NATO can destroy me whenever it wants to, because he's even making his argument on the basis of, I know if it goes back to might makes right, then I'll be destroyed.
Lose, right. We didn't start off talking about it, but when we did the last episode, the way we titled it was framing it against kind of the idea of dispensationalism. And I mean, you could do dispensationalism and to some extent like pessimistic amillennialism, where there are people who believe that either Christ is not reigning, or that his reign in heaven does not affect the world. And so much of this episode is really going, there's not just one or two evidences of these. It's everywhere. It's everywhere you look. If you're actually looking for Christ's authority, for the way the gospel has gone forth, for the way it's impacted the world, it becomes really difficult to deny it. And I mean, when you look at Daniel, and he says that, that the stone will come, and in the days of those kings, it's going to hit the feet, and then that stone that was cut without hands will expand and become a mountain. I think people go, oh, that has to happen in 5 minutes. But the fact that it takes several.
Think about it, a little stone that was cut without hands becoming a mountain that fills the whole earth. Where in there is the implication, especially when a prophecy is being made for 500 years? Where in there is an implication that it's going to be quick?
Right. And so I think it's one of these things where we swim in these waters and we get so used to the waters we swim in, and it's so easy to not think about how much has changed, how much has come about. It's worth people spending the time to think about these things. It's worth actually looking and going, am I denying God's goodness? Am I failing to give Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, and God the Father glory for the work they've done in the world? Because Christ has done a great work. His atonement is going forth.
Right. Jesus Christ said he came for the salvation of the world, and especially those who believe. And there is a real sense that he is changing the world, and that's what Christ said he came to do. And let's stop denying that Christ was successful. Because dispensational eschatology believes that Christ was unsuccessful. And he said it's finished. He said he will be successful. He will convict the world of sin. Everything that we're talking about here is a picture of the Holy Spirit convicting the world of sin. And it doesn't mean that everybody's saved.
Right.
It's especially those who believe, is that salvation comes, but there is a way that his coming, he came to undo the sin in the world. He came to cause all his enemies to be defeated and be made his footstool. These are the promises, and we can see it's happening. And to pretend like we're not seeing it happening requires you to close your eyes, requires you to be ignorant of history, requires you to pretend like you can't read what people said before, what people did before, because all these things are easily discovered. But yet, how many people sit in churches and they go, yeah, it's never been worse. I've heard that so many times, and it's like the only reason you can say it's never been worse is because you don't know anything. That is a statement that says, I am completely ignorant of the reality of what the creation looked like and what's happened over the last 2,000 years in particular.
It requires you to attribute to Satan and to evil the increase of order. It requires you, you have to either say it comes about and it's attributed to nothing. It just happens, which is, that's just
and that
evil.
rejects God as being God.
Right. So, it's just, you have to actually sit down and go, what caused this? Something caused it, and sin did not cause an increase in order.
As we talk about how, specifically two areas, an increase in shame and an increase in order, we should recognize that's the church's responsibility. The church is supposed to be proclaiming the gospel so that people see the shamefulness of their sin, which obviously the church in America is failing at. And also that God is a God of order, so you can trust that he is doing things in an orderly, in a reasonable way, in a way that we can take dominion with. And so as we finish this episode, this should be a call to us to work towards increasing shame and to work towards increasing order, because this is what the gospel's been doing, and we should be doing our part. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.